You have 30 days to leave this ranch, the HOA president told me while placing the notice on my kitchen table. Because this property no longer belongs under your control. I looked at the document, looked back at her, and said nothing. She had no idea that the papers she brought into my home would eventually expose everything she was trying to hide. My name is Ethan Walker, and my family has owned this ranch for 3 generations. The 300-acre property sits just outside a growing suburban community in Colorado, surrounded by open fields, old fencing, and the same land my grandfather worked with his own hands decades ago. To most people, it looks like a quiet family ranch. To the HOA, it had become an obstacle. The Homeowners Association was led by Victoria Caldwell, a president known for strict enforcement of community rules and ambitious development plans. For years, the ranch existed peacefully beside the neighborhood, but everything changed when new expansion projects started appearing on county planning maps. Suddenly, the HOA claimed my property violated community standards and demanded that I comply with regulations that were never part of my original ownership documents. Their first letter accused me of unauthorized land use. Their second letter warned that continued disagreement could lead to legal action. Then came the notice telling me I needed to leave. Most people would have immediately argued. They would have demanded explanations, called neighbors, or reacted emotionally. I did something different. I asked one simple question. Can you show me the recorded document that gives the HOA authority over my land? Victoria paused for only a moment before pointing to a set of community maps and development plans. They looked official, but I knew something important. Maps could show intentions. They could show future ideas. They could show boundaries people wanted to create. But they did not automatically change ownership records. That evening, I walked into the old barn behind my house and opened the fireproof safe my grandfather had left behind. Inside were decades of property records, survey documents, and handwritten notes that my family had carefully preserved. I was not looking for a fight. I was looking for the truth. As I reviewed the documents, I noticed something unusual. The HOA documents referenced a land agreement that I had never seen before. The date was familiar, but the recording information was missing. Someone had mentioned this agreement for years, yet there was no clear proof that it ever existed. The next morning, I contacted the county recorder's office and requested certified copies of every document connected to my property. What came back surprised even me. One file contained a reference to a review process that was not listed in the HOA records. The file number was connected to a federal land database, and my name appeared as the person responsible for verifying certain land records. The HOA believed they were dealing with a ranch owner protecting old family property. They did not know they had just challenged someone whose job was to uncover mistakes hidden inside land documentation. And when I opened that federal file, I discovered the first clue that this was never just about a ranch. It was about a decision someone had made years earlier, and someone had gone to great lengths to keep that decision buried. The next morning, I arrived at the county recorder's office before most people had started their day. I carried a folder containing my family's old property papers, but I left my personal assumptions behind. When you work with land records, the smallest detail can change the entire story. The clerk helped me request certified copies of every document connected to the ranch, including transfers, easements, boundary adjustments, and historical agreements. I expected to find a simple misunderstanding. Instead, I found a pattern. The HOA had been referencing a community development map that showed my ranch as part of a future expansion area, but the official property records told a completely different story. The legal description of my land had remained unchanged for decades. No transfer. No ownership agreement. No recorded easement. Nothing that gave the HOA control. I returned home and reviewed the documents again, this time looking at them from the perspective of someone responsible for identifying errors. That was when I noticed the second issue. The HOA was not just using an outdated map. They were also relying on a private planning document that appeared to treat a proposed future arrangement as if it already existed. Someone had taken an idea and presented it like a fact. That discovery changed my understanding of the entire situation. Victoria Caldwell was not simply enforcing a neighborhood rule. She was defending a position built on assumptions that had never been properly verified. Later that afternoon, I attended an HOA meeting because I wanted to hear their explanation directly. The room was filled with residents who believed they were protecting the community. Victoria stood at the front and presented colorful development maps showing new roads, improved facilities, and future growth. The audience saw progress. I saw missing documentation. When it was my turn to speak, I did not accuse anyone. I simply asked whether the HOA could provide the recorded instrument that gave them authority over my property. The room became quiet. Victoria answered that the association had relied on long-standing plans and previous discussions. That response revealed more than she probably intended. Plans and discussions were not the same as legal rights. After the meeting, one older resident approached me privately. He told me he remembered hearing about a land review years earlier but never knew why it was stopped. He said some board members had mentioned that the ranch created complications for future development. That conversation gave me a new question. If the HOA knew my property was important, why had they waited until now to challenge it? That night, I searched through additional county records and found a reference to a closed review involving the surrounding area. The file was incomplete, but one detail caught my attention. The review involved federal land classification and development impact. That was not something a local HOA could simply ignore. I opened my professional database and confirmed something I had suspected. The same property area had been flagged years earlier for additional verification. The HOA believed they were dealing with a private land dispute. They did not realize their actions had triggered a much larger review. And the more I looked, the more one question kept appearing. Who had known about this review before they sent me that eviction notice? The morning after I confirmed the federal review reference, I stopped looking at the situation as a disagreement between a homeowner and an HOA. I started looking at it as an investigation into how a property record could have been misunderstood for so long. My professional responsibility was simple. Follow the documents, verify the facts, and let the evidence explain the truth. I contacted the federal office connected to the land review file and requested access to the historical records. Within hours, I received confirmation that the area surrounding my ranch had been reviewed years earlier because of potential development changes and land classification questions. The information was not confidential, but it had never been part of any HOA discussion I had seen. The file contained something important. A previous review had identified my ranch as a privately owned parcel with specific protections and historical boundaries that could not be changed through local planning documents alone. That single detail explained why the HOA documents had always seemed incomplete. They were treating a future possibility as if it were an existing legal right. Before making any conclusions, I scheduled a meeting with Victoria Caldwell and requested that the HOA provide every document they used when sending the eviction notice. I wanted to give them a chance to explain their position. When we met, Victoria arrived with 2 board members and a stack of folders. She remained confident and told me the association had acted according to years of community planning. She explained that the ranch had become a challenge because future neighborhood improvements depended on access through certain areas of my property. I listened carefully, then asked one question. If the HOA believed it had authority over this land, why is there no recorded agreement showing that authority? For the first time, Victoria did not have an immediate answer. One board member opened a folder and pulled out a document that they believed solved the issue. It was a development agreement created more than a decade earlier. At first glance, it looked important. But when I reviewed the details, I noticed something immediately. The document described proposed cooperation between property owners and developers. It did not transfer ownership. It did not create an easement. It did not give the HOA control. The room became noticeably quieter, as everyone realized the same thing. The foundation of their argument was much weaker than they believed. After the meeting, I returned to my office and compared every HOA document against official records. That process revealed another surprising discovery. A former HOA legal advisor had written a recommendation years earlier explaining that any access rights would require a formal agreement with my family. The advice had been included in a meeting summary, but the final recommendation was missing from the documents provided to residents. Someone had removed the most important part of the discussion. That discovery opened an entirely new mystery. This was no longer just about a mistake. It suggested that someone inside the HOA had known the legal limitations and continued forward anyway. The county land review hearing was now only 3 weeks away, and I knew the next step would determine whether this was simply poor management, or something much more deliberate. Then, just before leaving my office, I received a message from someone I had never spoken with before. The sender identified herself as a former HOA board member, and her first sentence changed everything. "I think I know why they wanted your ranch." The message from the former HOA board member arrived late that evening, and I read it 3 times before deciding how to respond. Her name was Rachel Morgan, and she had served on the HOA board nearly 8 years earlier before leaving after disagreements about how certain development decisions were being handled. She agreed to meet the next morning at a small coffee shop away from the neighborhood. When she arrived, she brought a folder that looked older than the documents I had already collected. She placed it on the table and said, "I should have spoken up sooner." Inside were copies of meeting notes, emails, and draft proposals from the period when the HOA first began discussing expansion plans near my ranch. The documents revealed a completely different story from the one Victoria Caldwell had presented. The HOA had not suddenly discovered a property issue. They had been aware of my ranch for years because developers wanted access to the land for future growth. Rachel explained that the original discussions were never about whether my family owned the property. Everyone involved knew the ownership records were clear. The real question was whether the HOA could convince my family to cooperate before the larger development plans became public. One email immediately caught my attention. It was from a developer representative who had contacted the HOA about creating additional roads and utility connections. The message specifically mentioned that acquiring cooperation from my ranch would be the critical step before moving forward. That sentence changed the entire situation. The eviction notice was not about enforcing a community rule. It was pressure designed to make me surrender control before I understood the value of my own property. Rachel continued explaining that some board members wanted to negotiate openly, but others believed they could use HOA authority to create enough pressure that I would eventually give up. She showed me meeting notes where an attorney had advised the board that ownership rights could not be forced through HOA regulations. The recommendation was clear: negotiate fairly or risk a legal challenge. That advice had been discussed but never included in the final community updates sent to residents. I asked Rachel why she was coming forward now. She looked down at the documents and admitted she had regretted staying silent. She said many residents believed they were supporting a simple neighborhood improvement project, but they had never seen the complete picture. Before leaving, Rachel gave me one final document. It was a preliminary development map that showed something the HOA never mentioned. My ranch was not just located near the expansion area. It was the central connection point for the entire plan. Without access across my property, the proposed project would require a complete redesign. That explained why the pressure had increased so quickly. The HOA did not just want me to follow their rules. They needed my cooperation to protect a much larger investment. As I reviewed the document later that afternoon, another question emerged. If the developer knew my land was essential, did they also know the HOA did not have legal authority over it? The county hearing was now only days away, and I realized the next discovery could determine whether the developer was an innocent partner or someone who had known the truth all along. The day before the county land review hearing, I received a call from my attorney that changed the direction of the entire case. He had reviewed the documents Rachel provided and found something I had not noticed. The developer was not just working with the HOA. They had submitted preliminary plans to the county based on information that assumed access rights across my ranch already existed. That assumption had influenced everything that followed. The more we investigated, the clearer the pattern became. The HOA had presented my property as a future connection point, the developer had designed plans around that expectation, and everyone involved seemed to believe my family would eventually agree because the pressure would become too great to ignore. But nobody had ever obtained the one thing that mattered most, a legally recorded agreement. My attorney requested all development applications connected to the surrounding area, and within hours we received a large collection of records from the county planning department. I reviewed each document carefully, comparing them with the official land records I had already verified. Most of the information appeared normal until I reached the section describing property access. There it was again. A statement referring to anticipated cooperation from my ranch. That phrase stood out because anticipated cooperation was not a legal right. It was simply an expectation. Someone had turned a possible future agreement into the foundation of an entire development plan. The next morning, the county hearing began. Victoria Caldwell arrived with several HOA representatives and looked more confident than ever. She presented the situation as a disagreement caused by one property owner refusing to support community growth. She showed residents the proposed improvements and explained how the project would benefit everyone. For a moment, it sounded convincing. Then my attorney presented the certified land records, the federal review documents, and the internal HOA records showing that the association had known about the limitations of their authority. The room changed immediately. The county officials began asking questions that the HOA had never expected to answer. One official asked whether the association had any recorded document proving ownership rights or access rights over my ranch. Victoria's attorney responded that the HOA had relied on historical planning discussions and previous development expectations. The official looked through the documents and calmly explained that expectations could not replace recorded property rights. Then my attorney introduced Rachel's documents. The internal meeting notes revealed that the HOA's own legal advisor had warned the board years earlier that they could not force access through regulations alone. The hearing room became silent as everyone understood the importance of that information. The issue was no longer whether my ranch fit into the future plans. The issue was whether the HOA had knowingly ignored legal limitations while continuing to present those plans as certain. Before the hearing ended, the county scheduled a deeper review of the development application and requested additional documentation from both the HOA and the developer. As we walked outside, I thought the biggest mystery had finally been answered. But then my attorney received an email from the county office. Attached was a document that had never appeared in any previous records. It contained a signature from someone connected to the original development approval process. And if the signature was authentic, it could reveal who approved a plan that was never legally possible in the first place. The document attached to the county email arrived with a simple title, but the information inside changed the entire direction of the investigation. My attorney opened the file first and carefully reviewed every page before saying anything. It was a development approval record from several years earlier, and the signature at the bottom belonged to a former county planning official who had reviewed the original proposal. At first, it looked like another routine approval document. Then we noticed the important detail. The approval was not based on confirmed property access. It was based on a future agreement that had never been completed. The entire expansion plan had been built on the assumption that my family would eventually allow access to the ranch. The document did not prove ownership. It did not create a right of entry. It simply showed that someone believed a future agreement would happen. That difference was everything. The county hearing continued with a new level of attention. Officials who had previously focused on the disagreement between the HOA and my family were now examining how the entire development process had moved forward without verified access rights. Victoria Caldwell appeared less confident than before. The same documents she once used to support the HOA position were now creating questions she could not easily answer. The county review team requested additional records from the developer and the HOA, including communication between them before the eviction notice was sent. Within days, more information surfaced. Emails showed that the developer had asked the HOA multiple times whether the ranch access issue had been resolved. The HOA responses were carefully worded, saying that discussions were ongoing and that cooperation was expected. They never stated that a legal agreement already existed because one did not. That discovery changed the way I viewed the developer. They were not completely unaware. They had received warnings that the access issue was unresolved. The question was whether they had chosen to continue because they believed pressure would eventually force my family to cooperate. My attorney explained that this was an important distinction. A misunderstanding could be corrected. But ignoring known uncertainty and presenting it as guaranteed could create serious consequences for everyone involved. As the federal land review continued, I was asked to provide additional historical records from my family's files. I brought in my grandfather's original surveys, old correspondence, and property maintenance records showing that the ranch boundaries had remained consistent for decades. Those documents were not powerful because they were old. They were powerful because they matched the official records. Every piece of evidence pointed to the same conclusion. The land had never changed ownership. The assumptions around it had changed. The next morning, another unexpected person contacted my attorney. It was a former consultant who had worked with the developer during the early planning stages. She claimed she had warned the project team that the ranch access issue needed to be resolved before moving forward. She also claimed there was a meeting where someone suggested that the HOA could pressure me into accepting an agreement later. Her final statement was the one that mattered most. She said there were records from that meeting that had never been included in the official project files. With the final review approaching, the question was no longer whether the HOA had misunderstood my rights. The question was how many people had known the truth before they tried to make me leave. The final review meeting was scheduled for the following week, and by then the entire situation had changed from a neighborhood disagreement into a detailed examination of how a major development plan had been built on assumptions instead of verified facts. I arrived at the county office with my attorney and a complete set of records organized by date. I was not there to prove someone was wrong. I was there to make sure the official record reflected the truth. Before the meeting began, the former developer consultant who had contacted us arrived with a small folder of her own. Her name was Melissa Grant, and she explained that she had worked on the early planning stages before leaving the project. She said she had always believed the access issue would eventually be resolved, but she became concerned when she saw the HOA begin discussing enforcement actions against my ranch instead of continuing normal negotiations. Inside her folder were meeting summaries and email exchanges from the early development discussions. One message immediately caught everyone's attention. It showed that the developer's planning team had specifically noted that my property rights needed to be confirmed before final approval. Another message showed that the HOA had responded by saying they were confident the matter could be handled through community authority. That sentence became the focus of the review. The county officials asked a simple question. What legal authority did the HOA believe allowed them to force cooperation from a private property owner? No one could provide a clear answer. Victoria Caldwell remained composed, but the confidence she showed during the first meeting was gone. She explained that the HOA believed they were protecting the interests of residents and supporting future improvements. I understood that many homeowners had probably trusted the information they received. The problem was that the information was incomplete. They had been shown the vision of the project but not the legal obstacles behind it. The review panel examined the documents one by one. The original land records confirmed my ownership. The federal review confirmed the property's classification history. The HOA records confirmed that legal concerns had been raised years earlier. The developer records confirmed that access had always depended on an agreement that never happened. Each document answered one question while creating another. The biggest remaining issue was whether the HOA leadership had intentionally ignored the warnings or simply failed to understand their importance. Near the end of the meeting, the review officer made a statement that changed the atmosphere in the room. He explained that property disputes could be resolved, but public planning decisions required honesty about what rights actually existed. The next step would be a formal determination regarding the development approvals and the actions taken by the HOA. As everyone prepared to leave, Victoria approached me for the first time without a legal team standing beside her. She did not apologize, but she admitted something I never expected to hear. She said she had believed the HOA documents were accurate because previous leaders had always presented them that way. Then she asked one question that revealed how much had changed. If the review clears your property, would you still consider working with the community? I looked at the ranch documents in my folder and thought about why my family had protected that land for so long. The answer was not about winning. It was about making sure the truth came first. Before I could respond, my attorney received a message from the review office. The final determination had been completed, and one last finding had been added that involved the original HOA leadership team. The final determination from the review office arrived the next morning, and my attorney asked me to read it carefully before discussing what it meant. The document was not written like a victory announcement. It was a detailed explanation of facts, records, and decisions that had been examined over several weeks. The conclusion was clear. My family's ownership of the ranch was confirmed, and the HOA had no legal authority to force me to leave or claim control over the property through community rules. The development plans would need to be revised because they had been created around access that had never been legally secured. But the most important part of the report was not the decision about my land. It was the section describing the history of the HOA's actions. The review found that previous leadership had received legal guidance explaining the limitations of their authority. They had been informed that a private agreement would be required before any access or development changes could move forward. Instead of following that advice, the HOA continued with plans based on the expectation that my family would eventually cooperate. The report did not accuse every board member of intentionally causing harm. It made something more complicated clear. Poor decisions, incomplete information, and years of unchecked assumptions had created a situation that affected everyone. Residents who supported the expansion discovered that the project they believed was ready had never been legally complete. The developer learned that planning ahead did not replace obtaining proper rights. And the HOA leadership had to face the consequences of relying on documents that never provided the authority they claimed to have. A few days later, Victoria Caldwell requested another meeting. This time, she arrived without the confidence she had shown at the beginning. She brought several current board members and asked if we could discuss a different path forward. She admitted that she had trusted previous records without questioning whether those records were complete. She said she believed she was protecting the neighborhood, but she now understood that protecting a community required respecting the rights of the people around it. I listened carefully because I knew the situation was bigger than one person. Many homeowners had simply trusted the information provided by their leaders. They were not the people who created the problem. The people responsible were the ones who ignored questions instead of answering them. During the meeting, the new HOA leadership proposed creating a transparent process for future decisions, including independent legal reviews before any property-related actions were taken. They also offered to work with me on a lawful access agreement that would benefit the community while protecting my ownership rights. I agreed to review the proposal, but I made one thing clear. Any agreement would be based on respect, not pressure. As I drove back to the ranch that evening, I looked across the fields my family had cared for over generations. For weeks, I had been fighting to prove that the land was still mine. Now the larger lesson had become clear. Records matter. Evidence matters. And when people ignore the truth long enough, eventually the truth finds a way to return. The final step was still ahead. The access agreement, the future of the development, and the changes inside the HOA all depended on one last decision. This time, everyone would have to start with the facts. The final agreement was signed several weeks after the review was completed, but it looked nothing like the plan the HOA originally wanted. There were no forced decisions, no assumptions, and no pressure placed on my family. Every detail was reviewed carefully, every right was clearly defined, and every person involved understood exactly what they were agreeing to. The ranch remained mine, just as it had been for 3 generations. The difference was that the future around it would now be built on facts instead of expectations. The new HOA leadership held a community meeting to explain what had happened. Many residents attended because they wanted answers. For the first time, they saw the documents that had never been shown before. They learned that the eviction notice was never based on actual ownership rights. They learned that the development plans had depended on an agreement that did not exist. And they learned that protecting a community did not mean ignoring the rights of the people who lived beside it. Victoria Caldwell spoke briefly during the meeting. She did not try to defend every decision that had been made. Instead, she acknowledged that the HOA had relied too heavily on old assumptions and failed to verify important information. She explained that leadership was not just about making decisions quickly. It was about making decisions responsibly. That change in attitude was something I did not expect when this entire situation started. I had prepared myself for a long legal process, but what happened instead was a lesson in accountability. The developer eventually redesigned its plans to follow the actual property boundaries and legal requirements. The project continued, but it moved forward differently. It no longer depended on pressure or incomplete information. It depended on cooperation. A few months later, I stood near the edge of the ranch at sunset, looking across the same fields my grandfather once walked. The fences were still in the same places. The old barn was still standing. The land had not changed. What had changed was the understanding of everyone around it. I thought about the first day Victoria placed that notice on my table. She believed she was dealing with someone who would simply accept the decision and walk away. She never imagined that the documents she brought to my home would lead to a complete review of everything behind the situation. But the truth was never hidden because it was impossible to find. The truth was hidden because nobody had taken the time to look carefully enough. I never wanted the HOA to fail. I never wanted anyone to lose their home or their community. I only wanted the same thing every property owner deserves: respect for what the records actually say. My grandfather always told me that land is not protected by fences alone. It is protected by responsibility, honesty, and people willing to stand up for what is right. Years later, that lesson remained true. The ranch stayed with my family, the community moved forward, and everyone learned the same simple fact. When people ignore the truth, they may delay it, but they can never erase it.